Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zhang. That's definitely food for thought. So, Dr. Hal Cooper here. Okay.
David, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome all of you here. I'm going to talk about the One Belt, One Road program and what can be done to facilitate it in North America in general and the United States in particular. The first view graph, please. There we are. Now, if we're going to connect North America and Asia, we're going to have to connect it through the Bering Strait. Dr. Zhang and David Christie have both already identified the fact that we need to have a tunnel at the Bering Strait which would connect the existing rail lines of China and Russia with that of Canada and the United States, and then ultimately south into Latin America. Next slide, please. Now, this is 90 degrees out of phase, but it actually would show the connection between Wales, Alaska at the far western end of the Seward Peninsula and Ulen at the far eastern end of the Chukotka region in Russia. There's approximately 53 miles. There's two islands out in the middle, Little Diomede and Big Diomede. Little Diomede is 2 miles by 1 mile. It's about 1,000 feet high above the water. And Big Diomede Island in Russia is 4 miles by 2 miles, and it's also approximately the same height. There are no people living on Big Diomede Island in Russia, but there are on native people, about 200 on the American island. But there is a Russian military base and weather station there, and that's the connecting point. Next slide, please. Now, this is what it would look like both from a horizontal and vertical perspective. You have the crossing, as I mentioned, about 53 miles. There are mountains on both the Alaskan side, the Brooks Mountains, and the Takanyi Mountains in Chukotka. The village of Ulen is about 200 people, and Wales, Alaska is about 400 people. And as you can see from the elevation profile, you'd be building the tunnel somewhere between 100 and 200 feet below ground. It's in relatively stable rock. It's granite mixed with chalk and limestone primarily. And then you would have tunnels leading to elevator shafts leading to the surface in both Little Diomede and Big Diomede Island. And you can see the Brooks Mountains and the Takanyi Mountains, which would probably require tunnels being built through them as well. Next slide, please. Now, this is Northeastern Asia's present and future rail network. There is a line that's been built to Yakutsk, where it says to the Lena River there, possible Lena River Bridge. That line is a single-track rail. The Russian actually studies going back to Stalin's time in the 1930s. Actually had a rail line going all the west from Ulen at the Bering Strait all the way back to Vorkuta, which would then go to Moscow on the existing road. And interestingly enough, it was built to connect all their concentration camps together. And the same thing was for the southwestern line going from the Sakha Republic, which was called Yakutia then, all the way up to the Bering Strait, and there would be connection lines into the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then also on to Sakhalin Island, which could then connect to Japan. Next slide, please. Now, here's what the Eurasian Landbridge would look like with the connection of the One Belt, One Road into North America. It would, of course, come from Alaska, south to Edmonton, Alberta, and Calgary, and then a line going down the west coast, a primary corridor, and then a more secondary corridor on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, and another one on the east side connecting to both Phoenix and El Paso, and then a major connector from the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul down to Laredo, Texas, and then south into Latin America. And there would be separate lines going through Canada all the way over to Montreal and going to the southeast to Chicago and then to New York. And it's very critical that New York be a major part of this, and there would also be corridors to the southeast. But the primary connections, as you can see, to the west coast and to the east coast of the United States. Next slide, please. The West Coast Corridor, which of course would affect us directly, would come from Vancouver south all the way down to San Diego and to Tijuana, and it would have a connecting lines through the Central Valley of California and also the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and then a separate line going along the northwest coast of California, connecting through San Francisco that would require building a new tunnel underneath San Francisco Bay to connect Sausalito with San Francisco at the new transportation terminal that's being built in San Francisco. Next slide, please. This is another view of the West Coast corridor, emphasizing the primary route along the coast. And of course, there is a rail line from county all the way up to Eureka, but it isn't much used at all, and that would need to be built up significantly if the corridor were going to be developed fully. And there would need to be tunnels built through the Siskiyou Mountains on the Oregon-California border, and also south of Bakersfield at the Grapevine. Next slide, please. This is a route in California showing the potential high-speed rail lines. Of course, they are already planning to build between San Francisco and Los Angeles through the San Joaquin Valley, connecting Sacramento and Stockton with San Francisco and San Jose south to Bakersfield and then to Los Angeles. There's been a considerable amount of controversy about that. If you can move this slide up just a little bit to show Southern California, there is a private group that wants to build between Las Vegas and Palmdale, which would connect to the California high-speed rail line. And then there have been at least talk, but so far no action, of building over to Phoenix, Arizona and El Paso, Texas. Next slide, please. This is a view of the proposal of the Bering Strait Tunnel. If you can flip that, yeah. You can see 3 tubes, passenger and freight lines, with the different locomotives, and you can see off in the different distance both Little Diomede and Big Diomede Island. And Sarah Palin's joke about being able to see Alaska, or from Alaska to Chillicothe is not a joke. It just has to happen on days when you can see properly. I flew from Anchorage to Nome, and there's no place like Nome. And we flew over the Bering Sea, and that, of course, is a nice place in the summertime, but it has very harsh weather in the wintertime. So you would probably want to build a tunnel, because I think a bridge would be rather risky during the winter with very high winds and very cold temperatures and lots of ice. So it would be better to be 100 feet below the surface of the lower level of the water at 70 degrees plus rather than minus 30 above. Anyway, next slide. Now this is what the corridor would look like going up to Alaska from British Columbia. And I don't know how many of you have ever driven the Alaska Highway, but that's what it looks like. It's got lots of boreal forest trees. There's a highway in the middle, and you could build the railroad right along because it's a 500-foot wide right-of-way, and there's plenty of room for up to 6 tracks without any problem. And I suggested also either a water pipeline or natural gas as well. Next slide, please. This would be closer to home. If we're going to build the One Belt One Road along the West Coast, we're only going to have so much room for traffic going between Seattle and Vancouver, and it would be better if we had a freight line east out on the Cascade foothills that would go from Sumas on the north all the way down to Tenino, south of Olympia, going through North Bend and Snohomish and other areas along the Cascade foothills. And that could also be used for, of course, carrying the domestic freight. I made this proposal several years ago, but no one wanted to spend any money on it, even though it would have gotten the oil trains out of Seattle. Next slide. This is at the other end, in the Saha Republic, between Haptagai and Tabaga on the Lena River, and at that point it's about 3.5 miles wide. The river is up to 20 miles wide. It has a huge flow, although 5 to 6 months of the year it's ice and nothing flows on it, at least above where the ice is. I was there in Yakutsk in April of 1996, and the ice was just beginning to melt, and I wanted to go over to the other side of the river, and they said, well, there's no bridges. And I said, can you get a helicopter? No, we don't have one. We would have to drive in a truck. And they said, well, you might go 6 inches down in the ice, and you might go a foot, and you might go right through. I said, thank you, we'll stay on dry land. So there you are. Next slide. Now, if the line is built from the United States down to South America, it's going to come through all the countries of Central America. There's very minimal rail infrastructure there now, although recently Panama has signed an agreement with China to fund over 100 major projects of infrastructure and economic development in the country. And of course that serves as the connecting point between South America and Central America to North America. And with that, this makes it possible for the whole effort of connecting into South America. There is a bioceanic rail that's been proposed between Brazil and Peru, either through Bolivia or directly through Brazil, as a starting point for this. But it's going to be needed. Now, I spoke to people from Colombia and Panama about this project. How would they feel? And they were more immediately interested in getting the Pan-American Highway completed. And the answer was, we don't want it because we don't want drug traffickers coming through. That was the motivation. However, with the infrastructure and economic development, they would no longer need to be dependent upon drug production and transport through those countries. Now, Colombia is very interested in selling electric power to all of the countries of Central America through either hydroelectric or coal, particularly, some wind power as well. And their utilities are very much interested in that, and of course that could serve as a forerunner of this railroad, because there already is now a transmission line between Panama and Guatemala that has just been put in place. 500 megawatts, 230 kV. Next slide. Now, besides the Bering Strait Tunnel, we need another big one, and that's the Grapevine south of Bakersfield, between Grapevine and Castaic, which would allow us to connect Bakersfield and Los Angeles directly. And the California high-speed rail right now doesn't go that way. It goes over to the east through the Antelope Valley, which has drawn quite a bit of opposition. Unfortunately, the earlier proposals for the California high-speed rail had this line going up the west side of the valley, and then it would not serve any of the cities, and the people would have opposed it. So for political reasons, they decided that the smart thing to do was to build through the cities, but that also complicated the project considerably. And the answer is you need both, not just either one. Next slide. And this, of course, is another picture of the Cascade Foothills corridor with an oil train and an intermodal train carrying trailers and trucks. Next slide. And then I proposed how we could get the various countries involved, Russia, Canada, China, and the United States together. Probably the Chinese providing the primary source of the financing. And we, of course, need engineering and technical. We need an operating company. We need to have a lot of legal representation, which Dr. Zhang has already discussed in some detail. And we would need to produce electricity. It would take about 10,000 megawatts to get this thing all the way done from China to the United States. And then real estate company and tourism development. Next slide. It could take 10 years, but I think maybe more realistically it could take anywhere from 10 to 20 years. But again, it depends on how much we allow the regulatory and permitting processes to intervene. President Trump just yesterday announced that they want to speed construction pre-permitting project timelines to a maximum of 2 years. And that's exactly what's needed. There's too much bureaucratic and legal and administrative falderall that keeps us from getting our infrastructure built, and it also allows the project costs to be escalated instead of what they need to be, but 5 to 10 times as much, and to the point it's not usable. And if we need a model of what we need to do, it's to do exactly what China has been doing. Because they get it done, and they don't fool around, and the other thing is the country is run by engineers, not lawyers. People who want to believe in economic productivity and not adversarial conflict. And I think that is some of the things Dr. Zhang said it somewhat more politely than I did, but maybe I'm looking at it from an engineering perspective that's different from his. Next slide. What's it going to cost? You need to go down to the bottom, the last column. Yeah, there it is. From Beijing to Los Angeles would be $500 billion. If you go to New York, it's probably more like 700, but it would connect through Canada and to the eastern United States. Now, to get it done, what are we going to do? Simply, I think if China is going to get involved heavily in the United States, let's start where we have a problem today that we really need to deal with, and that's the tunnels coming into New York from New Jersey. The Trump administration, and even though Donald is from New York City, has very clearly avoided making any commitment that he wants to see funds from the U.S. government go to the tunnel. And the original agreement under the Obama administration was, at least on paper, was $10 billion for the federal government and $5 billion for the states of New Jersey and New York. And I have this funny feeling the Chinese need to step in for the federal part. In fact, a major part of the state as well. It'll get done. And then we have another $3 billion to fix up Penn Station. And then we go to the Northeast Corridor, which is $150 billion to fix it all up. And all this is owned by the U.S. government. That's what's important. And getting back to Dr. Zhang's question about risk, my own personal opinion is the Chinese would be very hesitant to invest in anything in the United States that did not have the prior and complete blessing of the United States government, because otherwise they're very likely to be stuck with all sorts of administrative rules, legal challenges and lawsuits. And again, we need to simplify things and make sure we can get things done rather than not get them done. And with that, I thank you.
Okay, well, just given the time, I think that well, we have about 20 minutes or so for question and answer. So for any of you that might either have thoughts or questions for any of the panelists, maybe what the best thing is, why don't you just say your question and then we can stand up.
Yeah, my question is for Don regarding the legal bridge. Would this be established by treaty, bilateral treaties amongst nations? How would it be established?
Some of the issues can be addressed by treaty, like the sovereign immunity. There's currently a draft of a United Nations Convention on foreign sovereign immunity, but it has not been signed by enough number of countries, so it's not taking effect. Even if it is a treaty that's signed by the United States or China, China needs to implement the treaty by domestic legislation. So otherwise, the treaty itself is not a law that will be enforced by the Chinese court. And it's the same principle here. So if when the United States signs a treaty, it's not automatically self-executing. So you need Congress to pass a law, even just to copy it word by word. Still, that's Congress that will copying the treaty, right? So then Congress, law passed by Congress, that will be enforceable in federal court.
Actually, if I could just make one brief interlude here. You know, I think a lot of these questions that are raised are, yes, indeed, we need legal frameworks, we need, you know, dialogue amongst nations and all that, but we also have to recognize that there is a very intense opposition for any collaboration with the United States collaborating with Russia or with China. I think that, you know, for whatever political problems Donald Trump may have otherwise, on that point, he's facing a very, very stiff resistance. And I think this goes back to the point that I was making, that there is a lot of this old residue of the geopolitical way of thinking, especially with those in the transatlantic financial community who think that a network of international banks and multinational cartels should set the terms for global trade. And this whole question of the multipolar approach and nations actually collaborating around mutually beneficial trade is they're not interested in seeing that world come about. And so there's this very intense animosity, and I think we need to, that's somewhat what I see, at least from my vantage point, which is of course from the political vantage point, that we have to change that viewpoint. There's no reason that this nation, with its history, that we should not embrace other nations and pursue the same spirit of economic collaboration and mutual benefit.
This is why I suggest we start between 8th Avenue in New York and Secaucus in New Jersey. There's a need right now, big time. They need $20 billion just to fix up the tunnels, and then another $3 to $5 billion to rebuild the stations. And that's got to get done right now, because otherwise you're facing a potential for the collapse of people being able to get to work in New York. How many people live in New Jersey who have important jobs in New York City? And the answer is a whole lot. And let's go strike where the problem is. It's in New York. Let's not get anybody just down in Lower Manhattan rather than Midtown.
Hey, Professor Dam, a question and also comment to your talk. We all know after 30-some years that China now has money, right?
Yeah.
Now, it looks like that they're starting spending money other than the United States, Latin America, Africa, and everything. But one trend looks like that they're trying to do things in a global scale, invest in infrastructure kind of things. That one of the interests I wanted to know that how that One Belt, One Road impact local economy in the state of Washington. And New York has problems. The state of Washington also has problems. We all know that every day we have this traffic problem, we have all kinds of things. It doesn't seem like here welcome the investment from China. It's all kinds of regulations, all kinds of things. What can we do? All things that local people can do to encourage the money come over here. Seattle ranked #2 city after LA. The Chinese people really want to come here. Locally, only thing we can see its benefit is the people buying houses from China. And local people sometimes say, hey, local housing prices jump up is because the Chinese buying. How can we get billions of dollars from China to do some infrastructure project here? That's my question.
Maybe Dr. Cooper is in a better position. I can speculate. I don't. Apparently, there are a lot of incentives for Chinese entrepreneurs to put their money here in the United States, right? They're also looking for.
Can you hold the microphone a little closer?
Yes. So one thing that so Mark, you are asking whether China is investing in infrastructure here or all kinds of investments. Can you clarify the question?
It seems like the Chinese has money, but they go somewhere else, not coming to us. It doesn't matter if it's infrastructure or joint venture or even, build the skyscrapers and have trouble either by China side, not a lot of money come to us, or here, if money come over here, they're scrutinizing where the money come from, where the money is produced, and all that stuff. It make it difficult. The people want to come, but it doesn't seem like we give them a good welcome. Like you go to Brazil, they want you the money. You go to Africa, they want you the money.
Yeah.
But here is so much regulation, things that make them, not quite clear what the right thing to do. One time I remember Gary Locke is talking about U.S. is most welcome for people to come. But the reality is it's not a whole lot of big project investment from China.
That's a really good question. I'm sure that your question is much better than my answer. So I only can speculate. I also want to say that some of the regulations, I'm not claiming this from empirical perspective, but some of the regulations on environment, on national security, I think that would be necessary. So we don't want to borrow money to come to state of Washington and then to build crazy project without considering, right, climate change and renewable energy and the national security, right? So, but China's investment in other parts of the world are for different purposes. So my understanding is that China's investment in South Latin American countries and Africa is more based on China's market needs of the resources, energy, mineral, and soybeans. So the infrastructure, I think, is closely linked with China's commodity demand. So there's a clear market rationality there. While China, in the relations with the United States, is different. That China is a manufacturer, so sending, flooding our market here by China's products already. So the relationship is different. In the meantime, I think there's certain level of hostility in the review process of China's investment. I think Congress needs to do a better balance between national security concerns and our market need. I definitely don't want to rule out the national security concerns are real, right? So, but in the meantime, how to make our market more transparent, welcoming, that would be definitely something that we need to do. In the meantime, China's investment in Europe in the last several years are also for different corporate strategies. China's investment acquisitions in the Spanish market and European market was after the financial crisis, right? A lot of this is to acquire either the brand that is more trustworthy in the whole world that China has a problem with, or technology, right? So after the financial crisis, that Spain has invested in so much in solar technology, therefore China, China's leaders, Li Keqiang went there, and then companies went there to acquire the technology. So in that sense, the brand and the technology, that will be the crucial consideration for China's investment. And in that, European is a better market because, very, very unfortunately, U.S. investment in renewable energy was really lagging behind, right, in recent years. In 2009, when I was writing an article, that the United States was already lagging behind China in terms of total investment in renewable energy. So if part of the corporate strategies was to acquire technology and then to even the market in Europe, then they have different strategies in the United States. So in that sense, the policymakers in this country definitely need to think a lot harder of the how to make the market transparent. But in the meantime, I really don't want to de-emphasize, because some of the companies, if they do have government background, do have military background, I'm in favor of very careful scrutiny.
Just
Go ahead.
well, go ahead. Why don't you, if you have something? Okay. Actually, just because I do think this is a relevant question that touches on a lot of topics here, or a lot of points to it. Well, first off, people should know that when Donald Trump and Xi Jinping met in Mar-a-Lago, they set up a grouping from the Chinese business community, Chinese government grouping, as well as U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and so on. And they were to discuss how the economic collaboration would go forward, and also did discuss the question of the investment into U.S. infrastructure. In fact, the head of one of the sovereign wealth funds of China, I think it's the CIC, the Chinese Investment Corporation, I believe, said that they were willing to convert some of their old non-performing U.S. treasuries into U.S. investments into infrastructure. So they want to invest into U.S. infrastructure. Part of the problem, though, is that there's not really a vehicle by which to do that that's efficient for it. Because I tell you, if you leave it in the hands of Wall Street that wants 12% returns on things or higher or whatever, you're not going to get those kind of returns from basic economic infrastructure, because that's not where the value lies. The value lies in providing a new platform for economic activity. What you need is a national banking structure. You need to go back to what Alexander Hamilton laid out. Nations can invest into, invest into the national banking, where a national bank will be able to facilitate the actual expenditure and getting the funds directed towards this economic infrastructure at low interest rates, because you need that's where you need to provide that kind of a platform. Let me just give you one example of this. The Grand Coulee Dam, right? People know this because we're in Washington. That's still providing energy, that's still providing water, and it has probably paid for itself multiple times over. So if you, and the way that Roosevelt financed this at the time, we didn't have money, right? We were in the Great Depression, right? What Roosevelt did is he set up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which acted as a national bank would, and funded these kind of projects, knowing that the future wealth generation capability would pay for the debt that was extended at the beginning, right? And so that's the kind of structures that we need to go back to, because if you're expecting the kind of returns that Wall Street expects, it's just not going to happen. So anyway, so I think that the question of a national bank is critical.
Diana Wu out there in the audience said to me before the discussion tonight, in direct answer to your question, that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, at the moment, under the present legal strictures and policies, for any project where there was direct investment in infrastructure in the state of Washington. That's why I'm suggesting you start where you can get it done. Now, there's another issue. Who's going to do the work? Not to be critical of the Chinese operations, but they have the tendency to want to do things by themselves. And let's face it, they can do it, and they have developed the means by which we can build efficiently and economically infrastructure. And they have done a marvelous job in their country of doing it. But if you try to export that model and use only or primarily Chinese people to do it, you're going to run into nothing but resistance. And that's why it's very important for there to be joint ventures between Chinese companies and organizations and U.S. companies. And what David said about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, it needs to be reactivated. And there's another organization that needs to be reactivated, and that's the Civilian Conservation Corps, to put people back to work, young people in particular, so that they're doing productive work rather than taking opioids or heroin.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to make one quick point. That McKinsey, which is a major consulting firm internationally, they actually put out a report on some of this question of does China employ people in the places that they're working. And actually they surveyed some 10,000, that there's about 10,000 firms in Africa, 90% of them privately owned. And they actually surveyed a number of them and found out that 89% of the employees in Africa were Africans. So there is, I know that this is part of that what goes out, that China likes to go in and have their own people doing things, but I think that this study does show that that is not the case. So anyway, so let's go on to the next question.
I was just wondering what kind of technology they have, because I hear about Bertha and it's not very good.
So the question was, what kind of technology do they have? And then the reference point was Bertha, right? The stalled tunnel boring machine. Perhaps Hal has a better sense of that, being an engineering consultant.
The biggest problem that I see is, back in 1975, during the end of the Nixon administration and the Ford administration, the U.S. government made the decision that it was going to get out of any high-speed ground transportation system research and development. It canceled it. And that was done for budgetary reasons, supposedly. What it was really designed to do was to make sure we had an all-highway and all-airline system for transportation. And since that time, the United States has been completely reliant on foreign countries. And most of the companies that have worked, and I was very much involved in the high-speed rail in Texas back in the 1980s. The companies who came in, French, German, Japanese, all wanted to do business the way they did in their country, and they were all looking for a big handout from the government, and they didn't really want to make any major investments in the railway. And without that, they couldn't get any U.S. investment. But the other side of the coin was, you had the American people that all were reading the manuals from the financial community in New York, and we only wanted projects that had 15 or 20% a year return on investment. And when that happened, it was just all a wasted effort, and that's why we haven't gotten anywhere with what we're doing. We've got to change the rules. David was very clear in what he said.
Yeah, right.
I have a question for Hal Cooper. This affects Seattle directly. The cost of moving goods via the Bering Strait versus containerized freight versus, via ocean-going ship. Is there an advantage for the by rail through the Bering Strait?
Just briefly, just in case anybody didn't hear it, the question is freight on cargo ships versus freight on railroads through the Bering Strait. What's the advantage of that through the Bering Strait?
If it's going to the eastern United States or eastern Canada, there would be an advantage with the Bering Strait Tunnel. Now, the Canadian National Railway already has a route that's somewhat complementary to this, where the ships go from Asia to Prince Rupert in northern British Columbia, and then they go across Canada, and they either go to Toronto and Montreal or to Chicago. Now, my own personal feeling is, I don't think containers are going to be what's going to make it happen. It's oil, it's molasses, coal, potash, basic materials. But the other thing it's going to do is it's going to be stimulating development in both Alaska and northern Canada as well as in Russia. And that's going to bring a lot of development that would otherwise never have happened. So in other words, a lot of it's going to be things that we need to be moving now. And of course, let's face it, our financial community in this country is hell-bent on maintaining a no-growth policy. We have to get rid of that, throw it in the garbage can before we can make headway. And the people who are going to point the way for us aren't China.
Just to somewhat back up what Dr. Cooper was saying, already what we're seeing is some of the Silk Road trains, which as of this year, there have now been 15 different European cities that have got these trains that come from China to Paris, to London, to various cities in Europe. The average freight time via shipping is somewhere in the close to 30 days. These Silk Road trains are getting the freight there in 15 to 18 days. So it's already, just in terms of time, being money. But I think what Dr. Cooper said is very important. It's not necessarily just shipping goods. It is developing the territory along these development corridors. They're not just transportation corridors, they're development corridors. And that's a very important concept. And I think the question of Arctic development, which would be implied with the Bering Strait, is extremely critical. I mean, there's a lot of minerals, resources, etc., which obviously we don't exploit in the sense of a simple exploitation, because you would actually have to develop these areas up there. And just as a kind of a fun thought object, we've pointed to the fact that really Arctic development, when you're dealing with the kind of intense temperatures and hostile conditions generally, it's probably more akin to almost like a space program. You'd be dealing with almost similar type issues that we've actually made a polemic that perhaps Arctic development could almost be a branch of your space program for that reason. So anyway, but there would be those kind of scientific breakthroughs that we would also make if you're thinking of it as a development corridor, that we're not just going, it's not just a simple transportation corridor, but we get to open up Arctic development in a way that will be needed for the future of mankind. So just...
Fairbanks, Alaska would become a major trade center of the United States if the Bering Strait Tunnel got built. And so would Eglinton in Chukotka. And also, getting us to the question of climate change, quote unquote, which is being used as a weapon to prevent this from happening. Let's not kid anybody. It's my opinion that less than 10% of the so-called global warming that's taking place occurs because of carbon dioxide being released from power plants in the United States burning coal. A much more important source is what's actually at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean now in methane hydrates, where the methane gets released. And there was an article in the paper last week that said that every methane molecule has 19 times the energy absorption capacity of a molecule of carbon dioxide. And yet this isn't being brought up. And there's what's called the North Pacific Blob, which interestingly enough was discovered by the University of Washington Oceanography Department out of the North Pacific. And actually it was a volcano. And yet they were purposely not connecting the heat from the volcano in the ocean and the change in the temperature with the atmosphere. And all they're saying is, well, 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide is causing the ocean to warm up. No, it isn't. Now, there is a concern with carbon dioxide with ocean acidification, but it's much more localized. And I think that, and another issue is that what's happening inside the Earth with the mantle, and is the fact that the orbit of the Earth and being closer to the sun, is that having an effect? In other words, anything that's naturally occurring gets taken away by the lobby for climate change that we have in this country today. And I think we can put the blame right squarely on the shoulders of our good friend George Soros.
Okay, I actually did not realize that we've gone past the time here. So just before we break up here and perhaps can have some discussion just amongst yourselves, again, I'd like to thank Mr. Xu of the NanHai Institute, also Tim Lee of the Bellevue Chinese Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring the event, and obviously Dr. Zhang from the University of Washington and Dr. Hal Cooper for being involved, and all of you for coming. So thank you very much, and until the next time.